Okay, good afternoon. It is 1:16, and we are back at what are we on? February, I don't even know what day it is anymore. February 21st, 2023. Neola is the first discussion we have, and we have Mrs. Edwina Oliver with us. Thank you for all of your work and your time. Members, you may recall, and I know that was discussed previously at a prior workshop when there was a process of where we were going through the review of our policies. I know that some of the changes happened before we had our newer board, and I think that instead of continuing on the path forward, it warranted a reassessment to make sure we're all on the same page so that we don't, certainly for lack of a better term, waste anyone's time because it's valuable. And I appreciate Mrs. Oliver's diligence. And again, I have to say, having dealt with the policy review processes over some time, and as I mentioned last time, that there are mechanisms from the administrative standpoint that need to be continuously addressed. And I think you've done a remarkable job on that, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
But for purposes of initial discussion, I know Mrs. Oliver had provided board members with a lot of background information, and that's perhaps, unless you wanted to start and give any overview, did you want to?
Yes,
Go ahead.
ma'am. We have a presentation here. I have a presentation here with just a few slides to give an overview of where we
Perfect.
are. And just based on the requests that we had at the agenda review, so making sure that I can cover that.
Yep.
So I want to say good afternoon, Dr. Foster and the school board members. Thank you for the opportunity to provide the overview related to Neola, as well as I first want to sincerely thank our district staff, my colleagues, for the work they've done so far and up to this point in regards to revising current school Sarasota County policies. And also, I want to say, secondly, as a project manager, that I was assigned to Neola, my primary responsibility was to make sure that this project stayed on task according to a projected timeline. And for me personally, as a 24-year employee of Sarasota County Schools, just making sure that I was being fiscally responsible for the assignments that was given to me. So with that being said, I just want to go ahead and say that today, very briefly, that I want to make sure I provide the clarity, the updates, and possibly next steps as we move forward. A recap, as Mrs. Ziegler has mentioned, this contract was originally approved January 18, 2022 by the previous school board. With that being in mind, the district staff participated in about 2 initial trainings that were related to board docs, which is the platform that is used, as well as to what Neola would include. Those trainings happened last May of 2022, and then at the beginning of this school year, August 22, here at the district office. Matter of fact, we were in the black awning when it happened. So far, where we are, the district staff work sessions, this is what it looks like. There are 9 sections to the NOLA policy project, starting with section 0, which is really the bylaws that the board would govern themselves accordingly, and then sections 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. The 9th section is community relations. But since that point, we previously as a staff have participated in 2 district staff work sessions based on these assigned sections. One was in November 2022, the other was January 2023, and we tentatively had one scheduled for last week, but we did cancel that until we could get further clarification from the board as well as our interim superintendent. Moving forward, the district staff and the Neola reps are a part of that work sessions. And tentatively what we have done is that we look at the policies that are assigned by sections, and they've been edited, well, not edited, but they were assigned by our associate superintendents or our executive directors to district staff. The district staff then referred to what current state laws and statutes were in place, reviewing the most recent school board policies that are based on NEFAC and practices, and then comparing the collective bargaining agreement. So they looked at all of these as they prepared and reviewed and edited the current policies. I want to say that these are in draft form. Nothing's been out available. They're in draft form on board docs. And then with that being said, editing the policies that are in draft form, they need to be reviewed with this interim superintendent or our superintendent and school board council before a scheduled work session with school board members. And I think that is a piece that was a disconnect in the beginning, whereas how does this process go once district staff start to work on them? Moving forward, this was the information that Mrs. Ziegler mentioned. These were the timelines that I sent out to everyone and discussed with Mr. Dugan as well in the meeting, just to bring everyone up to speed. But this is a tentative timeline right here, what you see, without any dates. The only dates that were on this timeline were when the board district work sessions were scheduled, and those had to be placed on the calendar when I got here in May and August, because we were working with the Neola and they work with other districts, and we were trying to figure out our time frame. So those right there were tentatively scheduled district work sessions. On our next slide would be a tentative projected timeline if we were to proceed and have scheduled board work sessions. Those were the dates that are highlighted, and that was information that, like I said, that you all have that you could review and just look at. We're not set to that. We're only set to, if we were to continue, is continuing with the project, would be to get the dates. And so they're all modified, and they all go based on what works best with the district staff and then Neola and their time frame. So these original dates were what we picked out moving ahead of time, but now moving forward. Where we are right now, our next steps is really for us as a district staff, me as a project manager, to seek clarification and next steps from our board and our interim superintendent about where do we go. Based on that, then those other steps 2 through 5 would happen. Notifying the staff, our district staff, if we are going to continue with the revised timeline, making sure they know what our next steps were, having the board bylaw work session with the board members, with the Neola reps being here to guide through that process. And that same process would happen for every section that is assigned from sections 1 through 9. But again, these are all proposed next steps. We can't go any further until we have till we get the clarification and the direction from our board members and our interim superintendent, so that our district staff will know how to proceed. Right now, this is information. Mrs. Ziegler did request this information, but right now the total price for the policy and procedures development, the piece that we've been doing, the draft piece, they're billed in 8 payments. The total cost is there, $57,275. We have paid 5 payments up to this point, totaling $35,975. We still have $7,100 that will be billed equally possibly in May, August, and November if we were to continue. And then as annual updates come from our state about updates, when they're released, they are billed at $22.75. So far, we've received 3 of those updates that we've already been billed for that came. And they do include 4 hours of time with the Neola reps and the district staff. And again, I repeat, 3 were already included in the original agreement. Board docs, similar to Novus, if we wanted to use that platform, would cost us an additional $11,600. I do want to thank Ms. Penner and Mr. Benswager. They gave me information about Novus, and currently with Novus, what you're paying is $59.50 annually, and that includes the $49.50 for just to having the agendas and the minutes, and then the $1,000 that allows you as board members to vote on your specific topics during the meetings. And that's it.
Thank you so much. Is it $1,000 a month to vote or annually?
Annually.
Okay,
I mean,
good.
that price,
It
yeah.
doesn't work all the time, so I was
Yes,
gonna say,
annually.
Oh boy, all
$59.50
right.
annually is what you all pay for Novus.
Thank you so much for that overview. And again, I do want to commend you for the work and the time frame of lining up to that, because that is was asked of you and not an easy thing to do. So I'm going to open it up to any questions from the board members before. That was the purpose of this particular workshop. So wanting to see so that we can seek clarity or direction, or are there any questions? Do we have this workshop for no reason? Like, seriously, Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam
Thank you.
Chair. I am not a proponent of continuing with Neola. When I look at the cost variable of the roughly $18,000 that we were paying for NEFAC, I think that's the correct pronunciation, and the cost of Neola in this first year, and I'm not seeing the work difference. I'm seeing that the work that staff has to put forth is the same, and the cost is much different. I'm also looking at the variable that with either, I'm hearing you say, and I wholeheartedly agree, that we need input from legal counsel. And in addition to that, my perception of when we go with Neola, that we become like several other counties. I individually do not want to be like several other counties. I want to set the pace and be the model. Absolutely look at what they're doing when it's an advantage and keeps us moving in excellence, but I don't want to be a rubber stamp of multiple other districts, and don't believe that when we've been at our best, we have been. So that's my input, is to shift gears.
Thank you. Mrs. Marinelli?
Thank you. I just have a question. Is HR using this system, or do they have to use a different system to update their policies?
We all use the same board
same?
docs, all departments.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Thank you. So, let me start again. I'm not a fan of Neola. Was not, for a couple different reasons. But one was that I didn't feel like it was solving the process issue. And I made that known back in whenever I think you said it was January, or even as this was formally discussed. But I was outvoted, and that's fine. My concern was the overhaul and then the alignment for what is really, I think, our biggest job next. We have policy and budget, and wanting to make sure that we certainly have, a support function, whether it be through our legal counsel or a combination of both, through legal counsel and what we've been using as NEFAC. Making sure we have a system in place that is updating our items as they come forward. Currently, NEFAC does send us updates, and we just have to have, again, that internal mechanism to do that. Something that I think that has been off and on, consistent. So to me is, I would like to go back to the way we had a lot more oversight and authority. We'd get an update with any kind of regulatory change legislatively or any agency change. NEFAC would support us through that, and then work through our legal counsel and staff to ensure we are in compliance. Mr. Enos?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And also, I don't know if you know Mr. Dugan, when he was at the sheriff's office, that's what he did, is he did the review of all of the policies of the sheriff's office, which is probably about 3 times as many as we probably have currently at the school board, and that would be obviously, and I know with Mr. McKinley, I know that's also what he does. I would rather be able to keep it local here and be able to do it, because when I actually was worked here as the chief and back at the sheriff's office when I was the lieutenant here, I would get the reviews all the time, and I would end up looking at them, reviewing them, and then having to make modifications and then send them back in. And I think that really gives it, because this is Sarasota, this is our community, and I think that we know it the best, and we have 2 experts on legal staff that's reviewed these and done those before, and I think that would be the best use of our funding.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards?
Thank you. I'm not surprised to see it back up for discussion, because I know that as board members you were not in favor of it. I can go either way. It's when we sit here, which we did most of the morning, and find lapses in our policies that have been lapsed and had reviews, and we've had reviews, and we still have lapses in our policies. Any force of reviewing our policies and getting it to where they need to be, I'm going to be in support of. In addition, if this goes to the wayside, which is what I'm assuming will most probably happen, I feel badly about the investment that we've made so far, and I appreciate all the time and effort that you, Mrs. Oliver, put into that. But I would request that in some fashion, our policies have a searchable window. I've asked for that before. I understand Neola was providing that. Not just for me as a board member, it's important. I think that we can search our policies and get to the policy that is specific to what it is that we're looking for, but I think it's important for the public as well. So those were my comments.
Thank you so much. I will reiterate, and I agree with that. And that's one of the areas, no matter who the vendor is, that process, and it's a little bit unique where I was talking to Mr. Duggan and Dr. Foster separately about this, is that it's a little unique where it is overseeing, there's a component of administration, and then there's a component of the board. And so where we need to be very clear, and that's why I said no matter what is decided upon today, I don't want to walk away without an absolute very clear direction that we come back with a specific process, whether it be an individual position, and that we have it explicitly listed out from a workflow process. Because if you look through the budget today, I mean, this has been something that's been brought up, and then it will be shifted. The board will vote on it, then it gets shifted down, and then it does, and then we end up with gaps, and so that's not acceptable from a fiscal standpoint either. So I agree with our ability to weigh in on and represent our community with our policies, but obviously we need to make sure they're compliant and make sure that they are followed through. And then when there are updates that we need, that who's going to own that, and so that we have that oversight to ensure that's happening. And so that remains to be something that we have to quickly respond to. And I know that certainly Patrick and I have talked about that, and Mr. Enos, thank you for that input, because I actually, in the conversation, I don't think I ever knew that was something that you handled at the Sheriff's Department. But as general counsel, obviously that's not going to be your job. But I think having that insight, Mr. Enos.
Yeah, and I would say that I would ask if Mr. Dugan can speak on it, and obviously Dr. Foster, from being a principal and as well as the executive director, HR is loaded with policy procedures, just to get their two inputs to regarding the verifying that this is something that it would be accomplished to the high level. And I think you're right. I think when we make decisions, we have to have the implementation of it. We just can't let it fall down to somebody else making the thing where, as Mr. Edwards said earlier, it was about how you get the selection process. Where do you get the stuff? What are we doing? Where are we getting at it? What's the numbers? I think that's obviously the devil is in the details to be able to give direction to where we want to go.
I agree. So I don't know, Dr. Foster, if you want to, I know we've talked about this, just at least from my perspective, do you want to shine some light on
Yeah, I can mention a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank Ms. Oliver and our staff members who have spent an incredible amount of time working on these policies. This has been over the course of a few months. I can speak specifically to HR because we had a significant number of policies that were part of this process. And I know we have a lot of people that have put a lot of time in behind the scenes. One thing that I had noticed in trying to kind of work through Neola, we're unique. We have a very big collective bargaining agreement. And what we noticed is a lot of things in our collective bargaining agreement were not in alignment with Neola. So we were rewriting a lot of policies or trying to make it work. And so we had policies written. I think we're at that point now where it's going to potentially cause a lot of extra legal fees in order to now evaluate those policies that we put in place because we haven't followed the language to a T that was in Neola. And I think, if the board does go this direction of moving back to NEFAC, that will allow us to spend time on going through some of our policies. I think there have been a couple things that have been brought up today where we need to kind of go through some of the policies, and we're finding that there are some things that we need to make sure that we have in place, or we need to change the language that's in those policies. And I think this will give our team the time to make that happen. I think trying to move full force to Neola was going to require a significant amount of time and a significant time from Mr. Duggan and others. So yes, I know we have talked about potentially having some kind of position that can oversee contracts and policies, et cetera. So this is something that I'm going to bring back to our team and look into what that might look like and how we can ensure that the policies that we have in place are being followed and that we are updating them on a timely basis.
Perfect. And then again, because like I said, it's unique with the overlap of board / administration, and so whatever that workflow, I think would be really prudent to have almost a visual like workflow process. So no matter who fills these seats, we have a best practice that it is not something that will go by the wayside. One thing that so I think that would be helpful. And then the question I have for Mr. Duggan would be what process would be to cancel our agreement with Neola?
So we obviously have a signed contract with Neola, and it does permit us to terminate it I looked at it yesterday in anticipation of this, and it's section 7 for anyone who wants to review it, but it says either party can terminate at any time. We have to provide written notice of an intention to terminate. We must pay for any and all charges for services rendered to date, and we'll jointly work with them to determine the amount due and what is payable based on the material and the services that have been provided and the amount of time they've spent on it. So if that is the route the board wanted to go, we would sit down with them and kind of work that out and resolve it.
So would it be prudent through board action that this afternoon a motion be made to direct you to move forward with that, or so that you can? Is it negotiation, or do you? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the
proper
best
process.
thing to be, I think that we would need to have public comment on it at some point ahead of terminating the contract. I think that would be the best, most transparent way to do it. I mean, I
So
guess,
at upcoming, so at the next meeting to put it on the agenda,
yes,
or
I think that would be for March 7th, would be, I guess, the next board date, right?
that is correct. Okay, I just want to make sure you had one more thing, and then Mr. Edwards, Dr. Foster, I know you mentioned something, and I think it kind of highlights this: the collective bargaining agreement. And I know we keep adding workshops, so if we're creating that dashboard, keep adding some things to it. But the collective bargaining agreement, as you mentioned through policy, has trying to that's aligning that synergy, and something that I would think would benefit myself and also with board members, and I think members even of the public, is to go have a workshop specific to our collective bargaining agreement, so we can go through and understand what's actually in it. I think that would also be very beneficial before we go through executive and before we prepare for collective bargaining. I think you don't know what you don't know if you're going in and we haven't gone through that. And so this would be going through what we have already agreed upon, what's the current, what we call the CAB, which is the CBA, collective bargaining agreement. So having a workshop specific to that, to my understanding, it's over 100 plus pages. So it won't be a short workshop, but I think it would be a very valuable use of time as we try to not stop working in silos and even from policy and decision-making processes. So again, when we look at our calendar with all those extra days, but I do think that would be beneficial. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. I don't think it's prudent to cancel a program until we have officially agreed on how we're going to be handling this process moving forward. So I'm concerned that we've given so far a March 7th deadline, and we don't have that process. I still have yet to hear from my fellow board members or somewhere in the administration that the policies will be searchable.
If I may, so I'll ask about the searchable, if that's Dr. Foster, I'll ask if you want to ask a member of staff, but I think what would make the most sense is so that we can move forward formally, perhaps this afternoon, making a motion of direction, then to come back, so that would be added to March 7th, but including a workflow process of at least, I'm not saying a new position or anything like that, but that we have some accountability measures in place so that there aren't things left by the wayside, because quite frankly, we have items, as Ms. Oliver knows, because she's worked kind of in reverse, that need to be adopted and approved and updated by July 1st to be in compliance. And so I don't want us to lose sight of that. So I think that would probably be the most appropriate. So no official action would be taken from canceling the contract, but direction on providing, with that intent to be added to the agenda with also a workflow process. Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I understood you to put forth in your conversation a draft structure of going forward. I'd like to see what the will of the board is in having you work directly with Dr. Foster and Mrs. Oliver to keep the work moving. It sounds like there's been tremendous review of some of our policies where there's really a foundation there, and also in conjunction with legal counsel to strengthen what that's going to look like, and at the same time continuing the Neola contract when I believe that this board is leaning towards deleting it, cost money. So I would like to see if there is the will of the board to have you go forward, strengthen that structure, and continue to have the Neola agenda item to delete their contract on the March 7th agenda?
Well, I see Dr. Foster on here, and then I can respond, unless she responds through that.
Oh, okay. I
Go
just
ahead.
wanted to mention on why we had canceled the meetings with Neola. There were some updates that were sent out, and I know the tremendous amount of time that was going to be required of staff to prepare for the meetings. I believe they were actually scheduled, I think, for this week. There were 2 days this week that we were supposed to meet, and so that's when I decided I didn't want staff to continue to put in that much time if we were kind of on the fence. So I wanted this meeting to happen to determine if we're going to move forward. If the decision is to move forward with Neola, then working with the two consultants that are with Neola to then fast track us to get us right back on track. But I didn't want staff to continue to spend the time that they've already spent on something if we were kind of on the fence. But regarding the potential thing to search, I think we could first look to NEFEC if they're not able to do it, if we do move into the NEFEC direction. Otherwise, I can work with Dr. Cantalupo and Mr. Benswinger to see if there's a way that we can get our policies in some kind of searchable form on our internet. So we can do that prior to that meeting as well. So as we're looking at what the procedures will look like, we can see if there's a searchable format so that we can address your concerns, Mr. Edwards.
I know on our website we can search them, but it may not be as streamlined as what perhaps you're looking for. But what I think probably would be the most appropriate function would be at the board meeting this evening for a motion to be made on next steps and then direction, so that could be potentially be added to the next board meeting for final and formal termination, as well as direction for the chair to work with the superintendent and council and respective staff to put a workflow in process, because I think it is imperative we line those two things up. As I've said, I don't want to do one without a solution to the other, and I think it sounds like that is a overwhelming board agreement. Is that, and I think that would give, that way we're not making, because you can't make decisions at a workshop. I think that would be the most appropriate function to do so at the board meeting today.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, but with the understanding that the final action will be later, but no, to give some direction for sure, I think that's acceptable.
Right, Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Clarification, please, on what exactly the motion will be, and are we counting on legal counsel to provide that to us in its appropriate manner?
Yeah, I can come up with some language if you like at the break.
I would.
But it would just
I'm
be,
not
I think
sure
it would
where
be
my
a,
colleagues are. I don't want silence when we get to that part, that we are prepared.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as certainly, my recommendation would be that there is a motion that is moving to terminate the Neola contract, that be added to the next agenda, March 7th agenda, and that the chair have approval to work with general counsel and the superintendent to draft a workflow process or procedure so that we are not so that we're not dropping the ball. So however you want to write that, but that there be a process in place to assure we are upholding our responsibility from the policy process and to maintain compliance. With like 5 less words, maybe. So it helps to have it written out in advance. Okay.
Whoops, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
There.
Are there any other comments on this? Mrs. Oliver, I want to thank you. I know, as you mentioned, this was something that you were following the directions that you had, and so this by no means is a reflection of the work you did. I can't tell you that. I think it overwhelmingly you were from the timeline and the diligence, I really appreciate it, and I do appreciate all the work staff has done. I regret that this is the way, but I do believe it's the best way forward for us. So if there are no additional comments or questions on Neola, thank you. Thank you so much. Moving on to number 10 is the recording parent meetings, and this is a policy discussion. This is on new business for advertisements, and I did add it to the workshop today, even though we have discussed it at length. I just want to give one more shot to discussion. I will tell you very candidly, this has been a long, many years, a couple years of discussion to really codify in rules or policy of what our consistent practice in this district has been for what I understand to be 20 years. I've heard that from members of staff. I've heard it from people who've worked with family members, and I think I've heard it reiterated up here by members of the board who used to be or were previous administration. And so the policy has taken a couple different iterations. The first one that I had brought forward was, in fact, a draft that was one of 3 options that the board actually took action on and then reversed course on, if just for a quick history lesson. And this is one I introduced back in December. And if you all have it accessible to you, there is a couple different tweaks I did want to raise to your attention. If everyone has the policy in front of them. So it says the use of, so I'll just start with the most important part of this is the intent, is to be very simply and underscoring that parents, legal guardians, have the right to record an individualized educational plan upon written request within, I think it's 48 hours of that request, period. That is the goal of this, and it is not, and that's been a practice when requested in the past. It's, and again, I defer to some members up here, but I know that this has been confirmed, and so it's just codifying this in rulemaking. This is not a new practice. That there was the addition of 504 only because that was recommended. I have some pause on that because I do not want to cause things to be more complicated than they need to be. And if it makes more sense that be stricken and that be a separate policy, because there may be different, because they are literally different regulatory nuances, that concerns me. The word notice, the word request versus notice, I'd like to change. So on the first paragraph, it has the use of audio recording devices at IEP. I'm going to address the 504 in a second. Will be permitted upon advance written. I want to strike, and I will do this at the board table, but if we have the proper editing, notice versus request, I think it makes it much more clear of the intent of a parent of a student with an IEP. I would also, it's open to discussion, but again, I want to make this as simple as possible because I think there's a lot of nuances in here where whatever our staff's individual roles are, the expectation is that they follow policy. I mean, I think there's certain things that are driven in here, and I believe the intent was added to make it very clear that this certainly is under management's authority to allow this, and that to rebalance the scales so that we have positive outcomes for both family and certainly our students being the goal. So my request again is changing request to notice and to strike 504 at the current moment because I'm concerned under the different regulatory bodies that oversee OCR versus administrative law judges. So that's just my concern. I worry that it's going to be convoluted, and the whole purpose of this is to make it clean and simple. I'm open to thoughts on, I think it's the 1, 2, 3, 4. So the 5th, 6th, and 7th paragraph are really additional details that I know that were provided by, I think there was a draft, but also council with the intent, and I don't want to speak for you, but I know we've discussed this, was to assure that there was providing more support to the process aspect that this is in fact the requirement. My only pause is that we don't put that in our other policies, and that when you have a position and there are regulatory aspects to that responsibility, it is the assumption, I shouldn't say assumptions, it is our policy that staff members do in fact follow within the job description and duties, correct? So we don't usually stipulate that unless I'm wrong, and I know we're ironically pinging right off of the prior discussion when you were reviewing some of the HR. I don't know if that is redundant and perhaps maybe signaling that there is this option of there was a discussion about opt-out, and that's not at all the intent. There's no opt-out provision for a member of staff to opt out of this. This is, if that's your job duty, that is your duty, and that's clearly written. I would stop with Dr. Foster if you have any comments on that.
Just one thing I would add is if we have it in this policy but not other policies, then it could be confusing to say, well, you didn't say if you didn't in the other policies. So I think to keep it consistent throughout all of Sarasota County School District policies, to keep it the same, which that is not something that we typically include.
So, and just to be clear, really it was sorry, these aren't, I apologize, these are not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These aren't numbered, but it would be 5, 6, and 7. To my knowledge, 5, 6, and 7 really don't, to my understanding, believe they need to be included in there. I think those are really more just descriptions. But I believe the first through fourth paragraph to cover the necessary things. Maybe 3 is not necessary, but I think again the intent is that a parent a parent or legal guardian is able to record an IEP with written notice within a 48-hour in advance. So, Mrs. Rose, I see you on the bus, but I just wanted to overview where we are going with this because it continues to come up, and I want to make it very clean and clear.
I would just, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to reference historically the individual education plan meetings for exceptional student education students, sometimes called special education, falls under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which does require the teacher of record to be at these meetings. I think that there's been so much dialogue about individual education plans in so many different directions. For me, it boils down to serving our students as best and as well as we can, which obviously the teacher is an extraordinarily important component to best develop a plan. I think that there is interpretation that paragraphs 6 and 7 lend a perception of opt-out, and there technically isn't a perception of opt-out. I think that we need to be clear, and I don't think that the policies, Dr. Foster, that you're referencing, do they all fall under IDEA, or are you just talking in general? Because IDEA is federal and overrides. So I would like to make it clear that there's a requirement unless the parent does excuse and then the meeting isn't held. I also would like to reiterate, not for purposes of modifying the verbiage here, but that I understand with all of the goings on in the last year or two, from any angle, any teacher's discomfort in a meeting, individual education plan, the onus is on our administrators, school-based, and on our administrators at the district level to make sure our teachers are comfortable and that they are feeling protected. I know that when I sat in as a ESE, Exceptional Student Education Liaison, or a principal, that was my job, to bring collaboration to the table, to get the focus back on the student and what we all as a team had in common. So for me, there's an onus on administration at the school level and at the district level to make sure our teachers feel comfortable. But regardless, under IDEA, we need and want and require our teachers to be there. So I think there's been so much confusion and verbiage coming from a multitude of different directions that, in my perception, hasn't always been about the student. And that if there's any concerns, absolutely every teacher should feel comfortable in every meeting, and that onus and accountability is on principals and district administrators to make sure that is occurring.
Thank
So
you.
I would like to keep the requirement in there, but refer to legal counsel. Can we reference IDEA and or Dr. Foster, on the other hand, when you were referring to it isn't in every other policy, are you referring to every policy that involves Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or overall?
I was just referring to policies overall. So, I mean, we can definitely make the note that it's IDEA or just include it.
Well, I'm looking to legal authority here.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys have a lot of flexibility here, and we can word it how you wish to word it. I will point out that both Florida's administrative code and the federal code of the Code of Federal Regulations, there are provisions that are not exactly worded the same, but they're pretty similar. and they provide for parents to excuse participants that are required participants when the school district is in consent as well. So I think you need at least parental consent in order to excuse people who are required attendees. It requires the school's consent as well. So we can word this however you wish. There might be some subtle differences between the IDEA and 504. So if you want to make that separate policies, we can do that as well. That's totally up to you guys. I think as written, it's fine, but certainly there's room to tweak it to make it exactly how you wish.
Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do agree with the 504 because in my life when I worked here, I was in charge of 504, and that is the Office of Civil Rights. But I've also worked extensively with IDEA and gone to the schools when there was a possible contentious meeting. And I just want to reiterate what Ms. Rose said, that somewhere along the line, teachers and administrators felt like they lost the ability to be able to say, stop. We will reconvene this meeting when a parent or an advocate is disrespectful. And I think we need to let teachers know that they do not have to be disrespected by parents or advocates, that that is the role of whatever administrator is there. You firmly but professionally say, we're going to stop this meeting until you can be talked, our professional staff can be talked to respectively. So I think we all need to let everybody know that that would be our expectation. So, because some of the fear that when I've talked with teachers and administrators is that when, not all, but a few advocates come in and a few parents come in, and they are very threatening in their tone of voice and their language to staff. And I think if we let them know that that's not going to be acceptable, our staff needs to be treated with the utmost professional respect. But IDEA trumps everything. And I know that in our packet we had the union concerns, but you know, IDEA trumps, federal law trumps everything. So I think it's important that our teachers are there, and I think it's important that they know that they're going to be supported.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards.
I commend Mrs. Marinelli for bringing that up, because that is the very first time in the 2 years that I've been a school board member that anyone has come to the defense of our staff in this process. And please do not confuse that with anti-parent.
No.
Please do not confuse that. But I would start by saying I think it might have been Dr. Foster. How many actual requests have we had this past year for the recording of IEP meetings? How many?
Sonia had shared there were 13 requests.
13. Okay. And of those 13, how many were denied, or how many did not happen because of the request?
Sonia had shared that 7 were able to continue with the recording. 6 had someone request not to be recorded, but the meetings were able to continue.
Okay. So what I'm overly concerned about is, and it was my colleague, Mrs. Rose, who educated me the most about IEP meetings in general. I completely understand that many of those IEPs are completely overwhelming to a knowledgeable parent. Dr. Foster pointed that out to me. A knowledgeable parent could be stressed at trying to navigate reading the actual IEP. So that the tool of recording is an absolute blessing, in my opinion, for parents that are new to IEP meetings or need to have reviews and should absolutely never be denied, ever, for those reasons. But as Mrs. Marinelli pointed out, that when things get contentious And again, I refer to Mrs. Rose, who said that's when the meeting should stop immediately and go back to square one. Where did we derail? How did that anger happen? Where did it happen? Let's start over. And so if we're trying to make sure that the tools are being used correctly and we're codifying this, then I suggest in the codification that there be a procedure and a way for an administrator to stop a meeting and redeploy it. And I think if we're getting that detailed for 13 meetings, that we have to continue and make sure that our staff feels that we have their back, because so far in the conversations that I've had with the staff, they don't feel that. They do not feel that.
Thank you. Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I feel like we're coming to consensus, and parents are entitled to emotions, and teachers are certainly entitled to be respected. And as a administrator for 14 years, I never had to call a meeting to an end or regroup it, although I would have if necessary. I think that we have quality staff, we have high quality, very experienced district executive directors, that this is a matter of protocol and common sense. That as a school-based administrator or district administrator, our job is to get a collaborative nature. And when you focus in on the child, it's hard-pressed for anybody to argue with you. It's when you get off track into perhaps some legitimate emotions or legitimate misperceptions. But I think that with some putting it in the hands of our district executive directors and ESE department, that those are protocols that occurred actually for years. So I would like to see that we solidify this and put it to rest and have it in a policy, because there's been entirely too much commotion around it, and these are our most vulnerable students that need strong clarification of where we're going. And I think everything that everybody's had to say, from Mrs. Marinelli to Mr. Edwards to myself, that this can be done and it can be done well.
Yeah, and I say I agree actually wholeheartedly. I think a lot of things that were addressed up here is one, addressing the simplicity, but also the fact of this being a tool where it's balancing the scales, but not where someone is one party or the other. And I think that's a really good point, that it's not, theirs is not coming from a purpose of being able to weaponize it. And if someone seeks to do that, well, they're there for the wrong reasons, 100%. I've heard from staff members who have felt that this would balance the scales because that they feel like they can go back to it where there perhaps was a difference of understanding based on what was agreed upon, and vice versa of the overwhelming. This is really coming at it as a very common sense aspect, but I would agree that it's interesting. It's unfortunate if this was a practice that was stalled for any reason because of people abusing or not being respectful. The child loses when that's happening. Adults need to recognize that's the case, and we need to be in the service of supporting one another so that we can come to resolution, and this will be that function to do so. So the one thing, and Mr. Edwards, I see you on I just wanted to clarify before going forward, and it really wouldn't require too many nuances, is striking 504. We can bring that back as a separate policy, but just for clarity, striking request and inputting notice on the first paragraph. And then I just need clarity, and I will defer to the subject matter experts up here, and as well as counsel when it comes to the paragraphs that I had brought forward that were more procedural. My only purpose of asking that is I don't want it to create more cumbersome or questions. If it creates more support and references to IDEA as mentioned, then I am absolutely, again, my colleagues up here have been in those roles and have heard it, so I defer to you. If Mr. Edwards, I know you had a comment, but do you mind if I get a response from our colleagues on the question I had from Mrs. Rose?
It was common knowledge for, ESE teacher for 13 and a half years, principal for 14, As a cost center head, you oversee individual education plan meetings. That we need our teachers at these meetings, and I think that we need to solidify their importance and again assure their comfort. And that balance surrounds the success of every student, and I'd like to see it in writing and to include, given the approval of legal counsel, to substantiate that in the fifth paragraph, given all of the diverse, sometimes could be perceived as divisive language surrounding IEP meetings. I want to focus in on the child, and we won't go wrong in supporting our teachers. So I'd like to just get clarification from legal counsel in that fifth paragraph, taking out 504, if that would be in referencing IDEA perhaps, or whatever language you would recommend, that we are clearly stating the expectations when delivering services to our neediest children, youth, and young adults.
Sure. So just to add, we're required to follow the IDEA and the 504 requirements, regardless if they're in a policy or not. So if you look at those last three paragraphs there, and we'll call them 5, 6, and 7, I think you could easily take out 5 and 6. I think they are just restatements of what the law is, of what we are just required to do anyway, whether they're in our policy or not. The last paragraph 7, I would say the same thing. I think we have some ability to control our employees and tell them what to do when they're at work, obviously. So I think you could take out paragraph 7 as well without losing anything. So to answer Ms. Ziegler's questions, I think that paragraphs 5, 6, and 7 are accurate, but are not necessary in the policy. Could come out. If that is something that is going to cause division, they could come out of the policy.
But to my colleagues, as far as, Mrs. Rose, I know you mentioned, is that because yes, we want to reference IDEA, or we know that IDEA is of which this is what is overriding, that's dictating the rules. Does it? We can always reference it. We reference our statutory aspects in them at all time. I really am indifferent. I don't.
I think we simplified. I'm fine with basically say we're going to record, and administration, school-based, and district can handle the rest of it. And it's all under the blanket of IDEA, of which all administrators, teachers, and we as board members are accountable for.
So I just want to make sure we're clear, because that would be stricken and amended at the table tonight, because it's being
Sure.
released.
Yeah, no,
as
so
advertisement.
I think it would be to amend the board has to decide. So I think that as written, if you have just the first 4 paragraphs, you could keep the 504 in there. I'm not aware of any obligation or any prohibition of recording a 504 meeting in the same way. But that's a decision from a policy standpoint for the board to make. So it would either be to amend to remove references to 504. That would be amendment number 1. I think I heard Ms. Ziegler say an amendment to change the word in the second line of the first paragraph to notice or notification instead of request. That would be the second amendment. The third amendment would be to remove the final 3 paragraphs. And the fourth amendment would be, if the board agrees with Mr. Edwards, to have some language to the effect of to permit, and I can wordsmith it, but to permit in the administration or district to stop the meeting if the meeting becomes overly adversarial in the view of the attending ranking district administrator present.
I just want to add that if I thought we were working towards simplifying it to basically we're recording, period, and that those protocols would be a given for any administrator, school-based or district.
Mr. Edwards had his. Did you want to make a comment, and then Dr. Foster?
Thank you. I am baffled why we are spending so much time on 13 requests that got resolved amicably. We are struggling in teacher recruitment, and specifically teacher recruitment with IEP abilities. I am trying to work the consensus, but what we really have is what Ms. Rose has asked for. We already have, we leave it to the hands of our administrators and they solve the problem. And apparently that's happened. So why do we need a policy that is overlaid on our employees to resolve a problem that doesn't exist? Makes absolutely no sense to me. So you all can continue to go down the road that you think you need to go down, but it absolutely does not make any sense to alienate teachers needlessly when there's no problem here.
I strongly disagree, and it's funny how that completely flipped from a very positive discussion and deliberation of building consensus to that, but you are entitled to your opinion. Dr. Foster and then Mrs. Rose.
I'm not sure if we're keeping paragraph 7. I know that is a proposed amendment, but if we do, I would like I would recommend kind of making the language for HR to look similar to ESE. Under HR, you designate a specific person or a specific position, but ESE is left a little bit more as to the relevant person. So if we keep paragraph 7, I would maybe, I don't know, potentially say the department or
Yeah, and there were certain elements in there that made me worried that if we weren't identifying, I mean, there are specifically under IDEA very specific people that are to be a part of it that make up the IEP team. But some of the language worried me that it would tie our hands with an unforeseen consequence, if you will. Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My perspective that 1 family, 7 families, 13 families, and any 1 or more students in their family are just as important as the other 40-some thousand and will continue to be for me. And that I think that the more that we tell teachers with rhetoric and propaganda that they are uncomfortable or threatened, that I ask who is really generating that. I'd like to recommend that we solidify everything for every child, help every teacher understand the expectations which have always been there, and that we move forward and go with the first 4 paragraphs to simplify this and move on.
Very good. Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you. I don't want to have to repeat what Ms. Rose said, but absolutely. We wouldn't be here if there wasn't a problem. But the focus is the child. And these are special needs children whose parents are already overwhelmed. So if whatever we can do, whether it's for 1 or 13 parents, and I can guarantee there are more out there that just don't say anything. But our focus is the child, and we need to make this policy as understandable and as tight as can be, because we don't need to spend any more time going through all this. It's federal law. We codify federal law. So let's just move forward and get it done.
Very good. Again, this is a very positive thing. I like to turn it on that way. I think this will benefit everyone. I don't think we need to look at it through the lens of a negative aspect. I just think that it'll allow us to move onward and upward. So just for a clean draft, and I think we may have a little bit of extra time between the next meeting or so, if we will be done through an amendment because of what was advertised, but that there is a clean draft. But just to reiterate that paragraph number 504 being struck from the policy draft, and that request be replaced with notice in paragraph number 1, and paragraph 5, 6, and 7 be deleted, and that would be the draft that we'll bring forward. And I'll make sure we get a copy to every board member so that they are clear. But just to reiterate, that was that. So unless there are any additional comments on this particular topic, we will be moving on to, I'm sorry, I've got too many papers here. Maybe this is the good part. I believe we're on, what else do we have left here? Members' comments, which is actually relatively long. Mine, I swear, they won't be long, but we will start with, who's at the top? Mr. Edwards, you're up.
That is not a member comment. It is a topic for workshop
There you go.
discussion.
Okay.
So however you can finagle that into your workshop agenda.
Is there anything you want to, just so staff, if there's any supporting information or documents or anything of the sort that would make it a beneficial?
No, I'm good.
You don't want to talk about it now then? No. Okay. So I'm just going to put it under yourself, just because if it's up at the top, it's really, if there's a presentation from staff, that's all.
Yeah, I don't need staff.
So, but so next week, next board meeting, it'll be Tom Edwards campus visit. Is that okay for you? Okay. All right, just want to be clear, Mr. Enos, you have field naming and parent liaison.
Yeah, we'll just talk about field naming. One of the things, again, it comes back to the policy decisions. There's nothing in policy 8.55 that actually says who can make a recommendation to name anything, nor does it actually have anything in there that talks about who's going to actually do the approval or denial. So what I did is I've been working with Ms. Foster and Mr. Slayton. So I have had a couple of requests that have come to me. And I think that that's something that definitely that should be an easy. I'll have actually the policy is all done. I will have it submitted to you. So by the time we get in, if we could put that, if we need a workshop or whatever we need to do for that, I'll make sure that everybody has it so that we can quickly look at that. And I think that is one of the things that will be super, super positive
Fun. I'm
for our district. And I have nothing on the parental liaison piece. I'm still collecting data from other areas that have something like that, but nobody has anything like that. So it's something that's totally different.
So just to make sure, and then kind of hinging off what we talked about today, so there is a discussion. This would be a policy draft. So, Dr. Foster, have you been working with Mr. Enos, or from a time frame standpoint, or any action that needs to be done on your end or staff's end, so that a policy draft comes towards us? And when should we expect that?
Yeah, so I've talked to Mr. Enos and I talked to Mr. Slayton, and so I'll get together with Mr. Slayton so that we can finalize what that should look like. Mm-hmm.
It's actually all done. I received it, so I'll get it with you. I'll send it
So
to
get
you,
it
too.
to Miss Dr. Foster and then Mrs. Tompkins, so that it can be ready for agenda review, which is Thursday, and then it can go on March 7th.
Perfect.
Everybody. So if it doesn't make it before then it goes on the next meeting. So if it's a policy draft, is that okay? Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you. Yes, not this March one, but before the end of the year, I would like to have on for a workshop our interagency agreements and all the, I know that Mrs. Penner, I believe, gathered that information of what foundations and other organizations have programs or donate money that go to help our students, but I'd like to hear that and to see the data that it is having an impact on student achievement.
Thank you. So I know that the interagency agreement, at least those had come through. And again, just to make sure, so to add that to making sure staff has, or Dr. Foster has the clarity of whatever is needed and what member of staff. So if that would be either on the March 7th or the March 21st based on capacity. Again, Mr. Edwards made a good point that the Sarasota SMH grant program, the hospital. Give me a title for that I can call it, because I always struggle with what do you want me to call it?
It doesn't have a title other than
You got to give me one.
Academy.
Healthcare Academy. Thank you. Okay, so
SMH partnership.
all right. But
So how long do you recommend for that?
and do you have staff? You mentioned, do you know all this? What staff needs to be there? No. Yes, we need to know. So what?
Okay.
So
Okay.
I mean, we don't have to have that discussion.
Okay, but we'll get to okay. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So then I just want to make sure that So, because what happens is then we we adjourn, and then we have a meeting and agenda review, and I can't talk to anybody. So I just want to make sure we're all steering in the right direction. Okay. So with that, because depending on what the capacity is for the March 7th, then when it comes to the interagency agreements and what you want to discuss or cover through that, the way I understand it, and to correct me if I'm wrong, because there are some other moving parts, we were talking about grant funding, but interagency agreements, are they separate? Are they combined?
Well, I would, well, there seems to be a lot of what Ms. Penner put together, a lot. So if it would be all right
Poor
if I
Bonnie.
work with Dr. Foster on that.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
and we can decide and get back, because, to go through the interagency agreements and everything, I would like to work with her, and we can, because then if there's any data that has to be gathered, then she would be able to get that.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. So Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I look at the board meeting, the workshop today, I thought started out where we were really focusing in on academic achievement and our fiduciary responsibility with taxpayer dollars. I feel like we have moved into an arena where we are just adding things to agendas based on how long it's been on a list. I am requesting board chair to look at how we're prioritizing and on the premise of what, because I'm still looking at the progress monitoring data, drilling into specific reading recovery data, and the funds going towards that for grade 3 reading, the use of Orton Gillingham as a new resource to address those primary grades reading. And if we don't change what happens in kindergarten through the 3rd grade, the rest of it becomes much more challenging in creating an achievement gap where students are below grade level. When I look at the grant funding, we have the Community Foundation working with USF. I don't know the details of that and the reading programs that they have in place. I feel like when we get off into a board member being concerned about other board members visiting a school or the nursing program, absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt, we need to serve our community. But I can tell you that I am prioritizing academic achievement. It is my highest priority, and every single student within it. I would like to have the board chair consider having a ranking for board members of how we prioritize what we're addressing next. Not that any and all of it doesn't have importance, but none of it is as important to me as the academic achievement in the primary grades. Right now, today, all of the programs that are being funded achievement-wise by grants, as Mrs. Marinelli has pointed out, what is the return on investment? How many of our staff are involved? We have been working with Reading Recovery for 7 years. And where are our reading categorical dollars going? There's just so much that I feel like we start to get off here, there, and everywhere. And I'm requesting the board chair's consideration to actually prioritize on agreed upon priorities consensus from this entire workshop board members.
No, I understand. I mean, there's a lot, and that's why if you even look at the top of my thing, saying more workshops, but at the same time being sensitive to the staff's ability to execute upon all of the things that we discuss, going through the conversations, and even myself having, again, and also being very cognizant of our chief financial officer, who is has kind of, we have talked about a lot of different priorities of which she is responsible for, but there's also really, really heavy lifting happening right now when it comes to financials. But in my mind, if we were to peel back and go back, if I were to overview of what we were talking about, and in general, what I think is so important, and as one board member saying, really honing in on and narrowing in on our core focus, which is academic achievement, and anything that really kind of pulls us outside of that. That's why these long meetings actually were my goal, is so we can get them off the docket and get back to what we're here to do, because I think it starts to make it untenable. So when I think about interlocal agreements, the grant qualification, some of the programs, I think a lot of these line up. We're saying different things, but that if I were to summarize, and I think this goes straight into academic achievement, is the evaluation of our current programs that are funded through grants and through third party or interlocal, and what that impact is having on our academic achievement, period. And that's not a new concept. That's something we've discussed, but I think it's been done in a silo. And I think it would really be something that staff needs to help us understand. How do we have this conversation in an effective, efficient manner? Instead of having, one little cherry here over here on this conversation and workshop and this one and this one. I think a lot of the initial data has been pulled, but we never seem to get down to where we're to the real evidence of us being able to make an informed decision. Reading recovery being a great example of that. We've had it for 7 years. We're talking about like the financial impact and what's the academic impact. We're talking about a variety of programs that were listed that may not really have a direct, they may be indirect impact to academic achievement. So, Dr. Foster, I mean, as you listen to a lot of these conversations, because that would be my goal, is how do we kind of take a lot of those, and there's about 3 of them that I think all intersect. I don't like that word, but you know what I mean, that fall in line, but that's going to be the most productive use of time, so that we can get to the point of we're evaluating every program, every partnership, and for the goal of academic achievement. And does this warrant the continuation, or does it warrant to evaluate an off ramp?
And I think when we decide how many meetings we're going to have, how we're going to move forward with the workshops, I think, you know, we have a number of staff members here today because we have a variety of topics. I think it's possible that we can kind of earmark certain workshops for certain topics. So, for example, I heard reading recovery. We already talked about pre-K. We've talked about progress monitoring. So we could have a workshop that focuses on all of those topics together, and then that we would have that team, and maybe wouldn't need some of the other people to be in attendance, because we could have that clear focus. We could have another workshop that focuses on, you know, budget, grants, the interagency agreements, because they kind of seem to all be connecting. But I think if we had workshops with, you know, in the next month, if we were to say these are our next 3 to 4, that we could put like topics on the same day, so we can have the staff here that need to be for that particular workshop, and then the rest of the, you know, our team can continue to do the work that they need to do, so that you can get the information as a board that you need related to each individual topic. But that was just a thought I was having in my mind as I was hearing topics, and kind of starting to categorize things to say these things work well as a theme of something, so that by the end of the workshop we have clear ideas of how we want to move forward. Otherwise, we're going to be taking some ideas on this workshop, some on this workshop, and some on this workshop.
And that's I think that's a very, I mean, I like that idea. I'm trying to get away from, I wanted to, so we are checking off the areas that I think we're saying, and I think a lot of the supporting documentation's almost there, but we're not honing in on actionable evaluation or where we want to go forward. Mr. Edwards, I know you have your, but I don't know if Mrs. Rose would but go ahead.
I'm fine.
Okay, good. Mr. Edwards.
I guess I made a very conscious decision not to say that 3 topics that showed up on today's workshop, which was Neola, walking children to class, and the recording of IEP meetings, had never been discussed in the since the new board members, other than public comments to my knowledge, and they showed up as topics of conversation that I, as a board member, was asked to participate in. I didn't argue them. I sat quietly, and I just reiterated my position on wanting these other topics to, that's not to say I disagree with discussing reading. Reading and progress monitoring and all of the things that Ms. Rose has mentioned, I value as discussions. But I do resent that when I disagree, which I clearly did about the recording of IEP meetings, I was called negative. And that the tone turned negative. I just disagreed. And I said, and I resent being accused, however subtly, that because I disagree, that my focus is not on the child. That's completely out of line, and I don't accept that, and I say that publicly. My work and my reputation here as a board member speaks for itself, and when you do hear the topics that I brought up that I would like to discuss, I hope that you get on board with the fact that it was all in the best interest of our students. So I look forward to all of the topics that were presented as opportunities for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Rose.
I can't imagine that Dr. Cantalupo and Dr. Moore don't have all that data in our curriculum department, so I don't feel like there's heavy lifting there, and I could imagine that that's already passed on to principals and teachers. So when we look at heavy lifting, I think it's been done and is available, and if we don't have the ability to get it on a future agenda, perhaps having access to it.
Wait, with specific information, I want to make sure.
Well, they have the progress monitoring results.
So that's going to be that's our next
mid-year.
workshop. That's our
Okay,
next workshop. So
perfect.
progress monitoring 2, is that right? 2. PM2 is on our March 7th. Oh, it's in our March workshop, so we'll look at. But yes, okay. And then what I wanted to highlight. What was the other thing though? Because I want to make sure.
It just drilling down into the data. I know they already have it and they've already passed it on. So my point was that it wasn't going to require heavy lifting, and that it's coming up in March. I could not be more excited, and I can't wait to get into it.
Right. No. So there we go. So and then I'm gonna work with staff from the interlocal agreements and grant qualification, just so we can come into where is going to be the most optimal use of time, so that we're getting it down, that it's aligning to academic achievement and evaluating it, so that again falls in line with our budget timeline, so that we're making these decisions, because I think that's what I heard all of us talk about collectively. And then and just quick clarification, I did the both walking students to class and IEP recordings were on the December workshop. We did discuss them and actually voted on them. So, but I know that there are some additional items that we want to discuss, and being that we're going through a superintendent search, that's where I said more workshops really are. I want to be fair to our board members, but I also want to make sure we're addressing all the academic aspects and not having to push off, progress monitoring or what have you. So now that we have a 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and a 3 o'clock meeting, the meetings that we have now I'm going to get them all mixed up, but potentially we're going to have some additional 2 workshops a month at this point. My goal is that they don't look like today. It was really to go through a lot of things that we're just lingering on. We just need to cross them off the list, which will be very therapeutic, but so that we can get back to the very, very core components of the academic progress, and then utilize our financial budgeting process to support any mission and goals that we have. Mrs. Rose?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to add to the list for some time in the future, as my colleagues see it as where it fits in our priority, Oak Park School and support needed. I think that it is in line relative to the stipends that our teachers are given, and what that looks like in the future, as well as supports that they have. We have, a very small population at Oak Park, and I'd like to look to see hear from the principal in the future, if it is the will of my colleagues, and how we can look to exemplifying it in the year to come.
Thank you. No, and again, almost hinging off of as a second step, and I will again look at the calendar, and I guess I should stop and say the collective bargaining agreement workshop, because if I think of some of the collective bargaining we did this past time, which focused on Title I and ESC, that we were able to get over the line, but then just by pure classification, missed that didn't address Oak Park, and there were some concerns with that, and we obviously want to hone in on that. Again, from a priority standpoint, budget, but everything being on academic achievement, going in staffing, talking about how we're redeploying our resources. If I were to look, and I want feedback from board members, where does the evaluating the collective bargaining agreement fall for everyone? High, no, low?
I think for me, if I may, falls within getting a calendar of when it's most appropriate to start that, having staff, where does it fit in their priority, to lay that out for us. I think everything is relative to what are our priorities. Academic and fiduciary seem to have surfaced. I'm not solidifying that. And all of that has to align to calendars.
Okay. Anyone else? I think after even talking about this, I'm going to propose, and it's not going to be hard and fast, but working with what you guys have already on the calendar, some of the conversations we've had here, and pushing out maybe a 2, 3, or 4 month kind of workshop calendar. We can move it. It's not going to be advertised as hard and fast, but that way we'll have a better sense and making sure we're hitting the buckets and not working in silos. Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you. I would like to ask council, I need some clarification here. I thought the purpose of a school board was to make decisions what's best for students and staff and our parents. I worked for this district for 35 years, and I've come to many, many, many school board meetings, and I have never seen one until recently that if an individual board member has a problem with another board member or 2 board members or 3 board members, it's brought up and put on the agenda. I don't see the point of that. That's divisiveness, and I do not know what that helps for working as a team. But it seems like one board member always can bring up what other people are perceived of doing or not doing. And I do not think that's the purpose of a board meeting.
Well, the formation of the agenda is a work like a work product of the superintendent and the board chair, I would say. I think that's what our policies say. I think that's what the statutes say as well. Beyond that, I think it's up to the 2 of them to kind of bring topics for the public and for the board to consider. The board being in an oversight role and the superintendent being in an operations day-to-day role. As just a basic approach.
Thank you.
Dr.
That
Frost?
answers my question, so I guess I would leave that to the board chair and the superintendent to see why that would be brought up at a board meeting when there's complaints or things that perceive that other board members are doing.
Thank you. Dr. Foster?
So just for clarification, is the plan, because at this time we have currently 1 workshop planned per month. I know we've already talked about adding a second one in March. Are we looking to do 2 or going back to, because we used to have 2, are we looking to go back just so that I know as we start to map out where we're going to put these things that we would have 2 moving forward? Is that something that the
I
board wants
think
to discuss?
for the moment, for certainly in March, again, as we try to finalize the superintendent search process and whatever, there are in fact things that are more appropriate in a workshop and sometimes require follow-up relatively quickly. And I don't want to tie our hands, and I certainly don't want to call special meetings because I think those are much more labor-intensive when you have even a little bit more time to prepare. So for the sake of scheduling, I would say that certainly in March we would be looking at one. My hope would be not to continue on for too long, but as we see fit, I could certainly put forward, as you and I could work on putting kind of a proposed calendar for April and May. And then again, I think as was said, and that I would concur, is that we're really the emphasis being on all of our time discussion, our lining up our decision-making processes so that we're improving academic achievement, because that's going to, and those come in a lot of different ways. So I would say for a planning tentative April and tentative May, but let's hope we don't have to. I mean, it really depends on where we are with the superintendent search process and any additional ones.
Do you want dates on the calendar that you could cancel if not needed, but at least then everyone has them reserved on their calendar? Just a thought.
Yeah, and I think I know this has been discussed, but I tend to find it easier, well, maybe not, to do them on the same days we meet. But again, I just want to be able to make sure we're moving forward and tackling these, because as you can see, there's a lot of different things, and I just want to be thoughtful about it. Mrs. Rose.
I know in the past, informally, we've mentioned retreats, and I don't know if any of these agenda items are appropriate for a retreat, but perhaps we look to a retreat and get ourselves back to where we aren't asking staff to, do 2 workshops a month. It's where's the happy medium, but get ahead of accountability with academic achievement, considering that, you know, we've dropped to fifth, which is unusual for us. So I just feel this like vibration of being on it and ahead of it as it relates to school board votes and decisions.
No, I would agree. Okay, so I think plan on we'll have a March 7th workshop because we have the superintendent presentations. As was mentioned today, we'll schedule a retreat for certainly a budget meeting. I think within there, as we look at the time, like what we could address, I think it would be great if in that moment we talk about some priorities. So that is steering our time and our process and our energy, and that's very clear to staff. I don't want to just be meeting for the sake of meeting. I want to be able to get things done, and I truly don't want to have to require staff to sit here all day because it imposed, it's an imposition for them to be able to execute on the things we want to have done. So if that does that answer your question? So as of right now, March, I'm gonna, and then we'll do a retreat, I suppose. What if we want to call it, budget meeting, but budget retreat with priorities aligned to that, and we'll make sure that's a date in which works for everyone per the conversation we had earlier. So that goes over the workshops. One area that I think does demand a little bit more, would require some staff input is the student code of conduct and discipline. I do believe that has a huge impact on academic achievement, and I am concerned that we're seeing this nationwide. We're not anyone that's unique to this, but I do believe that one, as board members, and it's required under statute, that we approve a student code of conduct that gets reported to the Department of Education. I believe that's in June. If I recall, when that was referenced when I asked this question during agenda review. But working backwards, I think we oftentimes look at it from a statutory change. I want to make sure that we as a board address what we currently require, what practices we have in place. And I think that there's a lot of questions and concerns around that. And I want to make sure we have our, we're putting forward the best practices as possible. And I don't know that the board, again, this is a potential workshop discussion. So I think it's a priority. When we talk about teacher retention, when you talk to teachers, this is probably the number one reason why they're leaving. And there's no amount of money that we could throw at them for them to stay. And I think we need to be very serious about that. So, and again, when we talk about student code of conduct, I don't think that Sarasota County should just be what the state requires. We can elevate that expectation and standard. And I believe that does warrant a detailed conversation with staff. And I don't know what time frame that would look like as far as what would be a meaningful reports. I don't know, Mr. Enos, even if you have some insight as to, sorry, but from even from, your role as chief, or any members up here, to collect meaningful information so that we can have informed decisions where it allows us to adapt policy if need be to elevate the standard of expectation and the code of conduct in this school, the district, I think is very important. And I think that it benefits all our total mission. So, but in order to do that, it has to be something you guys all want to do. And then what meaningful data, so we can ask the superintendent to direct staff to bring that forward. So do you have any insights?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I've talked to, plenty of teachers in regard to that. I think also, you have one of the things, we just talked about, I'll give something as relative as possession of a tobacco product on campus. You could be at one place and you're going to get one consequence. You could be at another place, you're going to get a different consequence. You could be at another place, you're going to get a different consequence. And I think a lot of that is a consistency in regards to just making sure that as we get that, those are all different places. So you can get through, obviously I saw that we thank you to Dr. Foster and Mr. Renoff. We got the stats from the police department, which obviously can give you a snapshot of everything they're doing. Counseling, it talks about tobacco citation, canine search, it talks about. I think that is definitely relative, as well as we can also go out, if we're looking for law enforcement wise, we can also go out to our with our MOUs that law enforcement keep tons and tons of stats on juvenile crime regarding to UCR. The other thing is obviously our partner is DJJ, which ultimately uses Teen Court, and Teen Court is our diversion program. They would also be able to provide data with Heather Todd is exceptional over at Teen Court. Jenny Donovan is at Department of Juvenile Justice. She's the regional supervisor. So but definitely I can help and pull whatever data and get with staff to be able to pull that information that we can be able to look at that. The student discipline, I can tell you is, it's one of the stories I was talked to is, a student is in class, the teacher is consistently using every tool in their tool belt to redirect the child. And ultimately, the final step is to call for the office. They send someone down there to take the child out. The child goes outside. They calm the child down in 5 minutes. The child's back in the class, and it just re-engages. So we have to come up with a better, consistent, and be able to put those resources in there, because that 100% is what I'm hearing from the teachers is that they want to have support from the staff. The staff needs the training. They need us to basically make it the consistency and be able to use data in order to provide it. And I can help get whatever that you need in regard to anything as relates to any crimes or actions within our community.
Okay. I think that will put that, to me, if we were to talk about priorities, this is a huge priority because it overlaps and overlays over everything. But there's an element where I believe there's policy that's needed or to strengthen some of that level of enforcement. I could be wrong, but I think that the data would drive that. So as those conversations go on, I think another one is, when we talk about this, how many second chance agreements have we? Because we do reassignments, but we don't really have any data or insight into how many second chance agreements and what is that's driving that. And again, these are very difficult for us to make some of those decisions without having insight into that. Mrs. Rose?
Yes, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. If we don't have the kind of behavior required to learn, it has probably one of the highest impacts on academic achievement. I would also like to have my colleagues consider the other components in addition to the data that Mr. Enos has referenced. When we look at a committee coming together and creating our behavioral consequences and offenses, there's a range of consequences there's a range for every offense, from the least consequence to the most for the same offense. And as a principal, we converted over to where principals had the authority to suspend out of school or enact less severe or more severe within that range. And there's been a lot of empowerment given to the district office to provide oversight relative to how the state Department of Education perceives us to be, how many offenses that we have in this category or that category. I feel when we made that shift, it's almost proving to the district office of what the principal has been able to find out and the staff. I would like to have conversation in this process and hear from principals and get very real, because if you want a consequence to have its greatest impact, all 46,000 students in this district are all different human beings, and there is no rubber stamp, which is why there's a range. And we absolutely need input from the teacher. The same thing that we talked about with an IEP. As a principal, I wanted to make sure before I finalized or my staff finalized resources or consequences that were within that range, that the teacher was in agreement, felt supported, and that we got feedback in the future that it was working. That is a key element. And the further we put this into the landings in a district position, the further we get away from that, which is also in conjunction with how the family is supporting us, engaging with us in where that balance is in that range, and as far as the resources of guidance counselors, behavior specialists, ESE liaisons, what plans are being put together for corrective, positive choices of students, which takes me over to the balance of the consequences in that range for an offense and how that balances out with the restorative strategies. Obviously, those pieces, in addition to the statistics, if we don't peel away every layer and get information from the teachers in the classroom of what that looks like, I would legitimately have my teachers that I worked with over 14 years as a principal and or as a ESE liaison at Southside. I was in charge of discipline. If they're left out, they are legitimately frustrated and angry. And there's no rubber stamp for every single child. There is a pathway and a plan, and it actually takes a lot of work. It takes hours up front. However, if you spend those hours up front, and we have protocols and training and practices that everybody agrees on, from the classroom teacher to the family, and the success of students, it's way fewer hours in the long run, and it's much more success and achievement. So I think this is one more huge piece that I wholeheartedly agree is a monumental priority.
Mr. Enos.
And the other thing I would say is with that is I know back, one of the things that we're looking at is if your child is by high school level, it becomes very, very hard to correct any kind of actions. So one of the things we did look at, and maybe this is something for staff when we have that, because I think that the discipline thing is a pretty significant workshop, is to look at what our providers are able to do and push it down to the K through 5 to try to impact those families at the earliest and not wait till all of a sudden, they're 17 years old and now we're doing truancy checks. It's nothing against that program, but at what point is it that we originally looked at doing a discipline referral to keep kids in school, but had every single provider of services that could work for mental health. Well, just as an example, like JFC, Jewish Family Services, they had an anger management program. So they would come to the school and be able to provide that. Or if somebody had problems with theft. But it was for our youngest people, where I think is where that's the piece, or the services, where I believe. So again, that's something else that we can do. I know Dr. Foster and Mr. Renoff, there's lots of people in here, Ms. Moore, have had that, and that's very effective in using all of their tools. And I agree with Ms. Rose. We need to have the principals, and we need to have the staff, the teachers. We need to have people to be able to come forward to say, this is where we need to be. This is where the policy needs to go. And like I said, all those other things should all fall in there, because I really believe we need to provide those services and keep kids in school at the beginning instead of waiting until maybe potentially, because of the community, that unfortunately that they don't rebound.
Right. No, well, there's a lot. Okay. Mr. Edwards, I'm sorry. I'll summarize in a second.
Thanks. I had buzzed back a few people ago, but I agree overall that the topic is an important topic for a workshop. I wanted to start there by saying that I spend, for me personally, a great deal of time out in our schools. I meet with principals and have a pretty good understanding of how teachers feel. And one of the problems that I hear all the time as a board member is that what we discuss on the dais has little or nothing to do with what teachers are dealing with on a day-to-day basis in their classroom, and student conduct is one of the issues that appear for me on an ongoing basis. So I'm glad that it is going to be a topic of conversation, and I agree also that principals need to be in here representing their teachers and giving us the feedback that's necessary.
Thank you. Well, and because I had a sense that this would I'm glad, thank you for the dialogue from everyone. I appreciate that. That's exactly what I hope will garner some insight to Dr. Foster and staff as you come to what will make it a meaningful future workshop. What actionable information do you need to bring forward so that we can walk away with what are our next steps, what changes do we need to make, whether it be policy, financial resources, or a review of supporting organizations that we are working with. So that is, I have got my notes, and so we'll put that on as a priority but we need to kind of work. Dr. Foster, I'll have you work with your staff to try to determine when the best time would be based on everyone's bandwidth. The last piece, I'm going to scratch grant qualifications because I think we kind of already have addressed some of that stuff. The last piece I wanted to bring up is it's broad, like character education, SEL, DEI. So it actually stems off a bit of the behavioral aspect. If I go back to our January meeting, that there was some discussion about Character Strong, which I know Character Strong has come up. Oh, hey, we're getting hi. where did all these people come from? so character strong continues to come up. I know Dr. Foster and I've mentioned this, that it's an uneven, Mr. Renoff and myself, that it's an ongoing concern. But the one part that a couple, I just want to make sure that we are narrowing in on things that are going to in fact move us forward and not set us back, I guess, in general. That certainly there are these acronyms are used pretty heavily these days, and even with legislation not being allowable, I don't even know some of the times that what it is, how deeply or how much entrenched it is within our current academics or not. But I want to make sure that it doesn't end up becoming an area of distraction, because that is, I think that staff ultimately is there, as was mentioned, they're trying to move things along. They're focused on the right things. And if there's for lack of a better term, controversial term or practice or instruction or program that we're using, that I want to insulate staff so they're not having to deal with that backlash, because it's really not them making that decision, and they're just trying to do the best they can to do and serve their families and students. One of the concerns that I've had brought forward to me on Character Strong, and there's a many, is the aspect that I think it was stated in the January 17th workshop that Character Strong, and I could be wrong, that would decrease behavior by 88%. I don't have the packet in front of me, but also, and how character education aligns with the tiered program of MTSS. This is not my area of expertise. I'm looking over at Mrs. Marinelli and Mrs. Rose, but these are concerns that continuously come up, and they continue to come up. And I think they're coming from people that are doing a lot of research. I only know enough to be dangerous, but my concern is that we continue down a path and things aren't adding up. And I think there's character education that we can quickly, obviously be in compliance with, but as one board member, I've heard enough about Character Strong and have concerns about it that I just believe that we need to take a different path and do it as in the aspect of we need to move forward. There are a number and plentiful character education programs that we can utilize that I think will work well for us, and again will move us forward, so we're not continuously regurgitating the same conversation. I see Mrs. Rose, but then again, there was the concern about the alignment of character education with MTSS and the tiered program, and that being something that has, and that's not just locally, that's something that has been brought up in a lot of education circles, that is a concern, that it's moving towards, we're getting away from curriculum standards and going into more of the emotional standards. And again, academic achievement is our goal, that is our mission, and I want to make sure we stay very true to that. So I have Mrs. Rose and then Mrs. Marinelli. So, but again, to reiterate, I think we've heard a lot about it, and I will make it very clear that I want to see us move away from Character Strong. Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the pieces that I felt like I picked up on in the presentation, and thank you for all the work that you do, you are appreciated, was that Character Strong is being implemented in a variety of different ways, from the morning news to actual teachers enveloping lessons. That was a message to me of that there isn't consistency across the board in its importance or how it's presented, because having been school-based for many, many, many years, something on the morning news is far different than a teacher implementing it in their classroom. And given that I call controversy clutter, as a principal, I would get very irritated because it just gets in the way of the progress and the things that you can accomplish that everyone agrees on, because there's plenty of everyone agreeing on things. I, too, would like to write, for the time being, pause the Character Strong program and look to the behavior pieces that we have in place with whether it's First Step or the mental health programs that we've got contracted out, or the guidance department, social work department. I feel like we have resources in place, and I would like to look at pausing that for the time being.
Thank you, Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm very appreciative of everybody out there because not only was I a school counselor at Southside for almost 20 years, I was a program specialist, and then I was like Deb Jackalone. So I know how much work goes into this and how much you care. But we also know this is been a very controversial program, and a lot of things have been going on with it, whether all of it's true or not. So I think we do need to address it. And I did have concerns because being the one that had to implement the MTSS process all those years ago, and it's become quite, in my mind, and I looked at it and I've gotten feedback from other counselors, it's become quite cumbersome, and that was never really the role of the MTSS process. So I understand how it came to be, but I think we need to back up. And when I first mentioned that I'd like to see us pause this program, and part of the reason is because we need to focus on the academic achievement on our kids because they've missed a lot of school. We had South County kids miss 3 weeks. So, but I think we really need to step back and look at this, and there's all kinds of programs and all kinds of ways to do the requirement for character ed. I mean, we've done it for years and years and years, but I think we need to take in what our community is looking at it. And it is controversial because I have the utmost respect for you and know that all of you can come up with something that's going to not upset the majority of the community, which that's what we're hearing from. But there's a lot of people that like what's going on. But I think we need to really just step back and take a look and review it and pause it. I think that will do us all a lot of good. And that is not saying anything that you guys have done anything wrong, because you have not. You've done an excellent job of what you were tasked to do. So it's very hard to sit up here and have to say from now on this side, we need to pause it. But I say that out of tremendous respect for everybody. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Duggan, I know you're on here. I want to reiterate that I think that that this goes a couple more layers than that, and I'm trying to where I'm coming from is trying to avoid one more thing that is just sideswiping people and getting pummeled when you're just trying to do the right thing. But there are concerns, and they're coming down. I mean, and it's a broader one, and I think it's hard to kind of even stay ahead of it. But what I do know is that this is continuously becoming an issue. It's growing, and it concerns me that it's a distraction from our academic achievement, which is in fact undeniably all of our goals. So that's why I wanted to bring that forward. Mr. Duggan and then Mr. Edwards.
Mr. Edwards can go first. I just have a bit of housekeeping when we're finished. So
Oh,
if he has
sure.
something to add, I'm
Sure.
happy to
No,
wait.
No worries. Mr. Edwards, go ahead.
Thanks. I am kind of confused in terms of why we're having such an in-depth, character-strong conversation. I appreciate that you're all here. I'm not sure why, and what my concern is I appreciate that Mrs. Marinelli has a perception that she's hearing from a majority of the community. I'm not sure that that's accurate. So I think where I'm concerned is that it seems like a horse has left the train, the barn, and we're moving to pausing something when I also am kind of at a loss of the research that I've done in terms of the actual components of Character Strong, and we just got done talking about student conduct. There's a direct relationship from the curriculum of Character Strong to student conduct, and I too, and I'm sure all of you would feel like, how do we get this off our plate and not have to talk about it every which way from Sunday? So I don't know where this is going, but I reserve the right to speak for what I perceive to be the majority of the community who likes it. So There you go.
Thank you. No, to be fair, I brought this up as a conversation to bring forward to the board. We've certainly heard a lot from the public. I welcome people in the chambers, of course, but I did not direct staff to, or the superintendent to direct staff to come. So it was really more intended to bring forward as an initial conversation. One thing, actually, Mr. Edwards, that you mentioned about student code of conduct and then the direct correlation of character strong, that's the part where, that's one of the pieces where some of the data that I would be interested in seeing where that specific data would illustrate that. But I will tell you, I'm not saying I'm hearing from a majority of the community. I know that I've spent a lot of time doing research in a variety of ways, and I have genuine concerns over it. And I think that, as I mentioned in a previous workshop, that I do not put that burden on the shoulders of those who are just merely trying to do their absolute best. And I think that they are going at it with the best intentions. I think there are things that are coming that are this being used as a mechanism for not the best interest of what our mission is, and that merely is the reason I am as opposed to it. So, Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not saying either a majority of anything. I'm actually saying the same exact thing that I said with individual education plans. If it's 6 children or 13 families, they count as much as the other 46,000 students. Every family counts, every student counts, and that I'm extraordinarily confident that there are initiatives and programs that everyone could agree on, and we are just that good, and you are just that good. And I did start my comment out with the range of participation from the morning news to a teacher implementing it in the classroom. And the range alone is telling us how important a school sees the program. If they're putting it on the morning news, it's far different of how they're prioritizing it to take part of the instructional day in the morning. That's clear in your face. But no, every single family counts in my book. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, again, so for the purposes of just the superintendent, again, there is a requirement under character education. I know, I think it's, again, going back to when we were talking about Neola, if we're going to change course, that making sure that we have that solution in place, and even having conversations during agenda review with this kind of high level being brought up, is not wanting to duplicate the same thing and not knowing, right? So I would just ask, and I can certainly do this by the way of a motion, but to request that we press pause or suspend any character strong, but that the superintendent come back with a recommendation of a replacement for that.
Okay, I will work with Ms. Jackalone and her team, and we'll bring something back.
Very good. Okay, well, Mr. Duggan.
Yeah, sorry, I should have brought this up when we were talking about the IEP policy, but just in looking at it, so I can bring you back the best product for later today, I noticed that we did not put a policy number on it. So in sitting here looking, I think there's 2 logical places it could go. I'm looking for your input. The first would be under the student section. I would call it 5.712, and that would go right after parent access to information. The other place is in section 9, which is school community relations. It would be 9.12, and that is right after parental rights and responsibilities. I don't have a preference. I think it makes sense to pick a number so when you approve it, it's all ready to go.
It could go in both for me. Anyone have any? I mean,
I would use the first one. I think the parental rights, will leave that one away with just the thing that it's
so under chapter 5.
Yeah, I think that would be the better spot
Thank you,
for it.
Mr. Enos. Okay, so I don't see any more people's names up here. I think we've gotten through. We got through everything. Thank you, everyone, for your perseverance today in getting through it. We do have an executive session scheduled that we will need to adjourn this workshop, then reconvene to move to executive session. Mr. Duggan, I'm not sure because we did have a court reporter, but since we're making a little bit better time, was that court reporter available at an earlier moment, about an hour?
Well, I think so I can check. The lawyer did indicate to me, so it's going to be a guest appearance from a lawyer from our Tampa office talking about the particular matter at hand. He said he had availability through most of the afternoon. I would have to check with both the lawyer and with the court reporter. I can do that real fast. I haven't done that yet because I didn't know what time we were going to be finished.
Right. So we
But I had
will.
tentatively said 4 o'clock, not 4:15, just in case.
So if you can see if he's available 45 minutes earlier, so the board can have and superintendent can have a more extended break before our 6 o'clock school board meeting. I think we'd all.
I just don't know. We don't, without the, we need both the court reporter and the lawyer. So
Okay.
if the
Well,
court
we will
reporter is
adjourn
not-
this. We'll adjourn the workshop for today, and then reconvene once we confirm their availability. Since it is all right, we are adjourned for now.